Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week I conclude my series looking at Aberrant 2nd edition by taking a quick look at some of the notable differences between Aberrant 2nd edition and Aberrant 1st edition. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we talk about, well, what makes a new edition a new edition. Whenever a game does a new edition, there are always changes. Now, with Aberrant, we have a beautiful example of significant changes both in the setting and in the system. So I figured this is a great example to look at, well, the changes in an edition. The first two changes were actually pointed out to me by one of the writers for the new edition, Ian Watson. So thank you, Ian Watson, for pointing these out. And I will say in my history video and in my setting video, I stand corrected on these, and I'm going to talk about these two changes now. So the first change that was pointed out to me is that in 1st edition, the firemen saved a school bus. In 2nd edition, the fireman saves an apartment building. This is actually a significant change because it changes the scale at which the firemen operated. And I'm going to be talking about this more in a video next week, talking about, well, the scales of game. But basically, the firemen started off in the 1st edition with a personal challenge. He was seeing these kids in the school bus. He was directly involved in the school bus incident. And so that made a more personal element for him. Because, if anyone's ever been on a school bus, you know how open the inside of a school bus is. And how you can see the kids in the windows of a school bus if you're driving by one. So a school bus on fire, if you're a fireman, you're to some degree directly interacting with the kids on the school bus. An apartment building, you might interact with like 1 or 2 rooms, the rooms you're directly involved with helping, but you're not really going to interact with everyone in the building. You're not going to have the same personal urgency as a school bus fire. And so I think that changes it to a larger, more distant scale for the story. It makes the eruption of the firemen a reaction to a distant urgency, not an immediate personal urgency. And as I said, I will be talking about this in this concept of scaled story more next week. The other significant change is that in 1st edition there was a node in the brain that was found to give novas their powers. And in the 2nd edition, they changed it to nodules spread throughout the nova's bodies, akin to the lymphatic system. Now, this is kind of a significant change as well, because theoretically in 1st edition, you could lobotomize a nova and remove their powers. With it being nodules spread throughout their body, it's less likely. So that's a change I can actually very much get behind. But it's just a thematic change. It doesn't really change anything mechanically or even overall in the setting. It was just a subtle difference between the two editions. Another real change is more the stuff that hasn't happened yet. We don't see the death of the Nova slider. We don't see the initial looks at the conspiracy of Project Proteus and Project Utopia and those things. We don't see the death of certain generals or such. It basically, well, frankly, second edition sort of downplays the conspiracy angle a bit, but then again, you also have to kind of look at the eras. You know, the first edition was released in '98. And, well, let's face it, the world is a very different place. Conspiracy theories in a superhero game are kind of odd in the modern day. Because the conspiracy theories, well, let's face it, when you have real world conspiracy theories that are more convoluted than anything that can show up in the game, yeah, I can understand them not putting the old conspiracy theories center stage like they were in first edition. With that said, those are the main changes that immediately spring out at me between the two editions from the setting perspective. Now, mechanics-wise, of course we're dealing with the fact that we're dealing with two completely different systems. I mean, one is the storytelling system, a variant on the old storyteller system. The other is the story path system, which, while it still has the storyteller system in its genetics, it's a very different system with its things like momentum and scale. And that sort of affects the differences in how the systems are built. One of the first system issues, or system differences, is just in the attributes themselves. In first edition, we had the classic storyteller attributes: strength, dexterity, stamina for physical, perception, intelligence, and wits for mental, appearance, manipulation, and charisma for social. I'll take a brief talk about these. Well, strength, dexterity, and stamina are pretty much self-explanatory. Perception was, well, perception. Intelligence was how much you knew. Wits was how quick you were thinking on your feet. Charisma was your force of personality. Manipulation was, well, how good you were at getting people to do what you wanted. And appearance was how good looking you were. Now, appearance got removed outright from pretty much everything, starting with the storytelling system of World of Darkness 2nd. And for the attribute system for Aberrant 2nd edition, your physical are might, which it's not so much strength It's applying your strength or leverage. You could have a person who's 90 pounds dripping wet, and they could have a high might and be able to throw the 200-pound person quite well. Of course, dexterity and stamina are still in this system. But I do note that might isn't raw brute strength, it's the application of strength. Mental is now intellect, which is basically a book learning and application of book learning. Cunning, which is, well, yeah, it's thinking on your feet, reacting to situations, seeing how things go, etc., etc. And then resolve. Which is basically how, well, resolved you are doing things. How easy it is to make you change your mind, that sort of thing. For the social, we now have presence, which it's still pretty much your force of personality as charisma. We have manipulation, which is still pretty much your ability to get people to do things. And composure, replacing appearance. Composure, of course, being a case of, how unflappable you are, basically think about it as the difference between, say, Superman, who never gets angry in a fight, versus the Incredible Hulk, who, well, he is an anger monster. Superman would most likely have a much higher composure than Hulk. Just saying. And from there we get into a difference in how the mega attributes worked. In first edition, mega attributes did two things. First, they gave you auto successes. Second, they gave you abilities relating to them. Like, each dot you had gave you each dot you had in mega strength gave you an extra die to roll for strength, an extra auto success on any strength related checks, and then it gave you an ability related to your mega strength. Something you picked out of all the list of stuff that they had. In the new edition, the mega attributes don't really directly apply to strength per se. Like, you have might. Let's say you have a dot of mega might. That's not going to give you an extra dice to roll for your might checks. Instead, it's going to increase the scale for things related to might, like damage dealing type effects, and it's going to give you some advantages from a select list. Not many points, but it's going to give you 1 point towards one of these advantages. And that's the big difference in them, in mega attributes. And honestly, I like the new edition's approach simply because scale impacts so much. Like, if you take a dot in mega presence, that's increasing the scale for your leadership tests versus the old mega charisma, which gave you an ability and an extra dot and an auto success. Mega presence gives you dots towards a select group of edges, and it increases your leadership scale by 1. Now remember, if your scale is 3 higher than someone else's, they can't oppose you. So that increasing your leadership scale by 1 is actually a big damn deal. Just saying. And of course, the other big difference between the two is a lot of the things that they call edges in Training Continuum system were backgrounds in the old Aberrant system. So, dormancy, you have it at 1 or 2 dots in the 2nd edition. And what that means is, it's either, hey, you can just turn your powers off at 1 dot, 2 dots, you look completely different when you turn your powers off. Meanwhile, in 1st edition, dormancy did this. Each dot of dormancy you activated reduced your effective quantum level by 1 dot. Thus, if you were a high level Nova with, say, 6 quantum, you could never completely dorm yourself down. Meanwhile, 2nd edition dormancy, you're always completely dormed down. So that's another kind of subtle change. Also the fact that 2nd edition dormancy can actually change your appearance completely. But overall, I feel that the systems are similar enough that you can follow different things. One thing I really do find as a huge annoyance on the 2nd edition is that while it's the quantum powers do have dot levels to them, the official sheet and even the sheet done by Mr. Gone do not have dots for the 2nd edition powers. Only the 1st edition sheet actually had dots by the quantum powers. So you kind of, if you actually are a person who goes by the character sheet to figure out what information you need, you're kind of getting some wrong information. Because Nova powers do still have dots in both editions. And those are the major significant kind of changes between the 2 editions. With the last one just being a gripe at the difference between the character sheets and the inclusivity of information between the 2 edition sheets. Next week, I'm going to be doing an archival GMing talking about scale in games. So until then, I'd like you all to remember to have fun and keep gaming.